Well, today's theme is the greatest comeback story of all time. And the truth is that everybody just really loves a comeback story. We love it when the underdog wins. We love it when the third string is put in and makes it all the way to the end zone. There's something that moves us when someone with a terminal diagnosis recovers and beats the odds. It just gets us all choked up. Comeback stories are all around us. In 1985, Steve Jobs was fired from Apple, and he came back to invent some of the most creative technology we've ever seen. In 2011, RCA Records told Taylor Swift that she would just have to wait a few more years, and she would not be anything special. And we all know that she had her own comeback. In 2003, Lego was $800 million in debt and filling out their paperwork for bankruptcy when the grandson of the CEO said that he loved Star Wars so much that he wished his grandpa would invent a Star Wars Lego set. And then came all of the movies, all the Lego sets based on movies. And if you looked at the shelves in my house, you would see that Lego indeed has made a comeback. And naturally, in sports, the stories are endless. Michael Jordan, Tiger Woods, the Cubs. It's always when the underdog is down by unimaginable odds that we're surprised by the comeback. And in case you've forgotten, the story of the resurrection begins with the odds stacked against Jesus, beaten and bruised and crucified and buried, and that's where our story begins, in the down and out. Let's listen to what Luke tells us happened. On the first day of the week, at early dawn, they went to the tomb, taking the spices that they had prepared. They found the stone rolled away from the tomb. But when they went in, they did not find the body. While they were perplexed about this, suddenly 2 men in dazzling clothes stood beside them. The women were terrified, and they bowed their faces to the ground, but the men said to them, "Why do you look for the living among the dead? He is not here, but he has risen. Remember how he told you when he was in Galilee that the Son of Man must be handed over to the hands of sinners and be crucified, and on the third day rise again." And then they remembered his words. And returning from the tomb, they told all of this to the 11 and the rest. And now it was Mary Magdalene and Joanna and Mary, the mother of James, and the other women with them. They told it all to the apostles. But these words seemed to them an idle tale, and they didn't believe them. But Peter got up, he ran to the tomb, and he stooped and he looked in and he saw the clothes, and then he went home, amazed at what had happened. Luke tells us that the tomb was empty. But we don't know what happened between the time of Jesus' death and the time when the women found Jesus was no longer inside. And I want to know, how long does it take to come back to life? Just last week, a family in Johannesburg, South Africa, finally agreed to bury the body of their father who had been dead for 600 days. They were waiting and watching for his resurrection, hoping that this would be his moment, believing that his faith was strong enough to bring him back to life. So how long does it take for us to come back to life? I remember being in the 2nd grade. I was all happy because I got a day off of school, and I was going to my grandfather's funeral. And by the time I got to know my grandfather, all his hardened edges had softened quite a bit. And he would buy me ice cream and let me pick the numbers for his lottery tickets. And he always bought my winter coat. He told me so many jokes that when I stood in front of his dead body, I was sure that it was just a joke. And at any minute, he would come back to life. How long does it take to come back to life? The ironic beauty of the resurrection story in the Gospel of Luke is that the women don't actually see Jesus. In Luke's telling, there is no gardener who speaks. There is no Jesus calling the women by name. They arrive at the tomb and find it empty, and there are 2 strangers there dazzling white, and they say Jesus is risen, but they don't get that firsthand experience with him. And I think that the fact that they didn't see Jesus face to face right away is really good news for us. Because it means if you can't see how any of the messes that you are stuck in right now can possibly work themselves out, there's still hope for what's ahead. Famous author and theologian Barbara Brown Taylor was at a conference, and her publisher came up to her and caught her off guard, and he pulled her aside and he said, "What's next for you?" And he was referring to the book draft that she had submitted, but it didn't click right away, and he thought that she meant he was asking about her life, like, what are you doing next in your life? And she threw up her hands and she said, "I have no idea what's next for my life." He said, "I was just asking about your book." But the rest of the day, she was captivated by her own response. Her question it crossed the boundary between work and self and the different categories of her life, and she began to believe the fact that she couldn't see exactly what was next for her was the most hopeful thing. She had no idea what was coming next, but it was the unwritten future that gave her hope. Your story is also not yet finished. We are all a work in progress. In the Gospel of Luke, the resurrection is slow. It's not a blinding aha experience of the women and the spices and the magical encounter. It's a series of slow moments, of breadcrumbs that are dropped over 60 verses, a series of small moments where Jesus appeals in small ways on the road to Emmaus and in the breaking of the bread and in breakfast on the beach. And what each person in the story realizes, and what each one of you also knows to be true, is that our setbacks feel so awful in the moment. They are. Look at the crucifixion. It was the worst setback ever. And they thought it was all over. They shut out the lights and took off their jerseys and called it quits. But the disciples and the women, and often each one of us, we cannot yet see the comeback. And here's the truth. The fact that you're sitting here today means that your worst tragedies have not destroyed you. We're still here. But we stand at a crossroad. We join the women at the tomb, knowing that terrible things have happened in our lives and in our world, and knowing that there is a decision up ahead. One of my favorite authors speaks openly and honestly about her own battle with addiction and depression. And she says she always thinks back to this particular hike she took with her family. And when they got to the pinnacle of the hike, they were standing at this beautiful outlook. And she was looking over the water, and there was a wooden staircase that went down from the pinnacle down into the rocky water below. And she decided to take a walk down that staircase. And when she was halfway down, there was a platform. And she stood on the platform looking down, seeing the rocky, crashy waves, knowing if she took one or two more steps, that she would give in to her greatest fears. But her family was up high on that pinnacle, looking down at her on that platform. Her family was up there, and from that point, they could see the whole view. They could see God's beautiful creation. They could see the unity and beauty of their family. They could see everything that they loved about life. And when they started to realize that she was in danger on the platform, they yelled to her, "Come back. Come back." And I looked through my many translations and commentaries because I wanted to know something a little bit odd today. I wanted to see if risen and come back were the same in the Greek. And what I found is that several translations indeed do translate "he has risen" to "he has come back to life." And there are 8 times in the New Testament when the same invitation to come back to life is used for people who are sick or outcast or marginalized or left aside or in the middle of their worst crisis. And this mattered to me because I think if I said to you, "You need to rise from the dead," you would say, "Well, obviously, I'm alive." But I think it's a different invitation to invite you to come back to life. This is what Jesus does. He sees us standing on the platform, and he invites us to return to the life where we are connected to a people of faith, part of a community where you can see the big picture of all that God can do, where you're not mired in your own setback. He doesn't want us to dip our toes in that dangerous water of sin and death and despair. But we aren't supposed to stop there. We, as resurrection people, are supposed to go and get the other ones who are stuck, to see the other people who are struggling, to see the people who are stuck on the platform, or even worse, can't see any future or any hope for their lives. Henry Nouwen says that the miracle of resurrection for us is when we begin to hear and believe that the voice of love is stronger than the voice of death, because it is love that calls us up. It is love that puts the breath back in our lungs, and it is love for something better than the same old that brings us back to life. And in Luke's resurrection story, there are two responses. The women, after seeing the tomb, they run and they tell other people, and they're so excited for the good news, they just can't keep it to themselves. And it says in our text we read that it says they told them that it was an idle tale. That's what the men said to them. And the translation for that word is lyros, which means, actually, most scholars translate it to, they told the women that what they had to say was a pile of crap. The idea that Jesus could come back from the dead was so out of the ordinary, so fanatical, that they actually shamed the women for their faith and their testimony and their belief that we can come back, but they tell it anyway. They live it anyway, and they refuse to go back to the land of death. And they don't want anyone else to live there either. But Peter comes to the tomb, and he peers into the tomb, and the text says, he went home. And I think that we come to this day, the day of resurrection, with the same two options. To hear that the tomb is empty and say, hey, cool story. Go home unchanged. Another Easter, another Lily, another Cadbury egg. And I think that that's what many of you have done for many, many years. It's an option. It is. It's a life that just stays on the platform, lives in between, a life that is separate from the deep and life-changing experience with Jesus Christ. But I think that deep down, each and every one of you wants to believe that even if it takes a long time, even if the resurrection is slow, that there's a comeback not only for you, but for those you love who aren't here. Those who we know who aren't so sure about Jesus. But there isn't a football player in the locker room at halftime whose team is down that isn't praying for a comeback and isn't going to fight for his team to win. And let me tell you why this matters to me. It matters to me because I grew up with a faith that was on a side of my life. In our family, it was just one small piece of the pie. I had my weekday life, and then I had my sometimes Sunday life. And I never knew that following Jesus could change the weekdays and the weeknights and the weekends. I never knew that faith in Jesus could change my experiences with the setbacks, with disease, and with sin, and with struggle. I never knew that faith could change my marriage and really calm my fears. And I want you to know today that in my holy love for you, I see your setbacks. I see your losses. I know what you have endured. I know the struggles you are navigating and the people who have harmed you. I know the mistakes you've made and the battles you are fighting. And I want you to know that there is a voice calling you to come back to life. He is calling his people back to his church and calling his people back to a faith that saves. Tim Keller says that the resurrection is not a future consolation prize for a life well lived, but it is an invitation here and now to have the life you always wanted. Hate to break it to you, but you're no Steve Jobs, and you're no Michael Jordan, but there is a comeback waiting for you. Your next chapter is not yet written. Altogether, he is risen. Amen.